Hello and welcome to the fifth of six New York Forward Capacity Building webinars. My name is Stefan Lutter. I'm a revitalization specialist with New York Department of State. Pleased to be joined today by my colleagues Melissa Keller-Popsise and Rachel Bruce. The application for the second round of New York Forward has recently been announced with $100 million available in funding. Like the DRI, New York Forward communities develop a strategic investment plan and compile catalytic projects that build toward a community vision for revitalized downtown. As a reminder for those applying, the dates for this year's application are as follows. The applications are due via the CFA portal for all regions except New York City on September 29th at 4 p.m. For New York City, the applications must be emailed to your borough president office by September 8th at 4 p.m. Applications cannot and will not be accepted after the deadline. These educational webinars aim to help New York Forward communities understand the basics of downtown revitalization planning. Please note that these webinars were recorded last year, and as such, they contain some irrelevant references to previous dates and times. Please note that there is a recorded webinar dedicated to the DRI and New York Forward application process that has been posted to the New York Forward Capacity webinar website. That is essentially an application walkthrough. During the webinar, please submit any questions as they arise into the chat box. We'll answer those at the end. On Tuesday, we talked about formulating placemaking strategies and generating development interest. Today, the webinar focuses on project development. So without further ado, I will share my screen and we'll be underway.
Jessica Basher from the Land Use Law Center, and I'm going to be joined today by Kevin Dorka, Land Use and Economic Consultant. And let's just get up to speed about where we are and where we are headed. So you've seen us now over the last 4 webinars if you've been kind of going along as we work through them. If you're just joining this one, I encourage you to go back and take a look. So either way, I'll just remind you what we've covered. We started with talking about visioning and the visioning process and engaging our communities. And then we moved into community needs assessment and how we collected and aggregated quantitative data to inform us about our community needs. Then last week, we talked about goals and how they're developed using that qualitative information from the visioning process in conjunction with the data collected through community needs assessment. And goals are really identified and created in order to help identify and prioritize action-oriented approaches. They help communities measure its progress and make adjustments where needed. So we're moving from vision to goal, and then we started talking about strategies. A community will develop placemaking revitalization strategies that provide specific steps on how to achieve those goals. And so what we're really trying to move through is the downtown revitalization process that you need to go through in order to create a plan for revitalization. And again, it starts with engaging your community and developing a vision statement, and then identifying goals, and then putting those forward using strategies. We focused last week on strategies that our ultimate goal is to create, is to use placemaking as a strategy for what we're trying to achieve. So as a reminder, what is placemaking? Placemaking is the process of creating quality places. We want our downtowns to be quality places that people want to live, work, play, and learn in. We looked at a lot of different images about what this means, what makes a place a quality, and we looked at the specific facets of what makes a quality place. We looked at those in the context of what vision language would look like, what goal language would look like, and then more specifically, what strategies we put in place, and just some initial kind of identification of projects. And so we looked in the context of mixed uses, public spaces, transportation and housing options, historic preservation, community heritage, arts, culture, recreation, green spaces, and sustainability, and broadband capability. And really these facets then tie to that initial project development and identification that we talked about. But today I have Kevin with us to dig in deeper on that project development side.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking forward to talking with you today about developing your projects as part of a revitalization strategy. So we have an agenda for the day, and what I'd like to do is have you all understand contextually, when is the right moment to undertake project development in the revitalization planning process? What are the types of projects that you might consider as part of a revitalization plan? What are the steps involved in creating the project plan, your general project plan, all the projects that you have identified as being your pathways for revitalization? I would like us to develop an awareness of the component parts of the action plans, which are distinct from the general project plans. The action plans are the recipes, if you will, for how you move forward on specific projects. We're going to take a look at specific examples of revitalization projects, projects which have in fact been funded through the DRI program, but we chose projects that really represent the diversity of New York communities, including smaller communities. And the lessons learned here can be applied to any type of a revitalization planning process, whether it's one that has been framed through the DRI or New York Forward program, or whether you're already in the midst of a revitalization planning process, or pursuing one through a different set of funding programs or partners. These examples are going to be relevant to you regardless of where you are in that stage. And then lastly, I'm going to invite you to think about some best practices and case studies outside of New York. We have a lot to learn from our neighbors. So moving forward, let's revisit the conceptual revitalization planning process, which many of you have already seen a few times. And so, as Jessica had alluded to earlier, we move through these stages from visioning to a community needs assessment to a placemaking process. And that placemaking process reveals strategies that suggest particular courses of action. And those particular courses of actions are our projects. Then there's an implementation stage. And that's the stage when we try and figure out, okay, we have this collection of different projects that all seemingly add up to a revitalization plan, but how do we move forward? How do we get the projects complete? How do we avoid project delay? How do we tie together projects within a synergistic revitalization plan? Who's involved? Who's involved of what? How do we bring different parties together? How do we enable changes to happen in terms of regulations or policies to enable projects to move forward? Now let's take a look at the types of revitalization projects. These are just sort of different buckets, broader categories of the different types of projects that you might consider. And I want to say some of these projects are larger in scale, some are smaller, but I think that they would be appropriate for a wide variety of localities, including smaller towns. So bear with me, some of the projects might be big get first, and some of them are going to be shorter term and entail less costlier interventions. On the bigger scale would be major development projects, such as this one, which we're going to talk about more in depth in a bit, involving the reuse of a historic building in downtown Olean. The redevelopment of existing buildings can be a very powerful avenue for downtown revitalization. They can help to bring a certain energy to your downtown. They can increase your street traffic. They can repair vacancies that have been longstanding and that have created disincentives for other developers or tenants in the area. So a major redevelopment project has a lot of benefits. It can catalyze change not only on the exact block or parcel upon which that building sits, but it might incentivize change for your entire block, for your entire community. And the type of redevelopment, it could be, as in the case of the example I'm showing here from Olean, a larger multi-story building, but it might also be a 1 or 2 story building that somehow has come to serve as a focal point, or could serve as a focal point, as an anchor whereby you concentrate retail uses or residential uses or commercial office space. So that's one type of project. Then a second type of project would be public improvement projects and programming. So here I'm showing you an example, which will also go in deeper, from a pocket park that was created in Oswego. And this sort of category of projects is sort of a catch-all for interventions into the public realm. Projects that are aimed at improving communication infrastructure, or maybe introducing green elements into a downtown area through infrastructure or landscaping or streetscape improvements. It might be aimed at improving connectivity by bringing in changes to your transportation network, whether they be major changes like the introduction of a shuttle system or streetcar connection, or maybe smaller changes like modifying your curb cuts to make them more accessible to persons with disabilities, or improving the signage around the recreational trailheads. So there's a lot of ways in which these projects can be physical, but there's also a programmatic side to it. You might not even need to focus as much attention on the physical creation of a space or redesign of a space, and as much as it is making use of the open spaces and parks you already have, and finding innovative ways to bring more programming, ways to bring your community together, in the form of concerts or special events, community meetings, exhibitions, festivals. So here's a bundle of projects that embody both physical change and also programmatic ones. Next, you might consider revitalization projects that are smaller focused and that essentially make you partners with the owners of your buildings within your locality. And through the creation of a small grant program, such as the one that was created in Kingston, and many other communities in New York have these, where building owners can apply to the locality for a grant, and they can use that grant to fund a variety of changes, whether they be small scale improvements to a retail store or full scale restorations of a historic facade. The monies might be targeted more toward the residential sector, allowing homeowners a pathway toward improving the physical condition of their buildings or making them code compliant. These are changes that could be really small in scale, as little as maybe $5,000 grants or loans for building owners. And we'll talk more in depth about some of the mechanics that are involved in designing a program like this and making it work. And then there's branding and marketing initiatives. Again, not a physical project. And this type of initiative can be scaled depending on the size of your community. It could be like a very ambitious and expansive wayfinding program or installation of information kiosks on multiple commercial corridors where you are highlighting the historic heritage of your community and its linkages to the surrounding region. It might entail other types of interventions, such as those were adopted in Plattsburgh, where, and I'll go in more in depth on this one too, but where they undertook a program funded with DRI monies to allow for the installation of banners and new signage and an interactive map. These types of initiatives are in service to your existing residents to bring them together, give them a stronger sense of identity, incentivize them to come to downtown and shop. But they're also, of course, aimed at helping to increase the visibility of the community and to encourage the potential for tourism and folks coming in and taking advantage of all of the unique assets that you have in your locality. So those are the, different types of revitalization projects. And I might also add, that there's other types of revitalization initiatives, including the provision of social service programs, not programs that are necessarily always so easy to fund through revitalization programs, but that are still valuable and speak directly to the full range of needs, the social needs that we talked about when we presented the community needs assessment to you. Okay, so we're now at the stage of figuring out how do we create a general project plan. Remember, your project plan is your bundle of all the different types of projects and programs that come under your revitalization strategy, right? So it's not just one project. And there's a 5-step process which I will take you down, in which you begin by reviewing your goals and strategies. You inventory sites that might be ripe for redevelopment or rehabilitation within your revitalization area. You catalog your potential projects. You brainstorm with the community on some of those potential projects and look for additional ideas and welcome their creativity and innovation. And then you proceed to draft specific action plans, the details about how you would move these projects forward. So as you're creating this project plan, you're probably going to be mindful of, a question that comes up in every plan. Well, how do we avoid creating a laundry list of or wish list of projects that do not have funding, right? And we can't afford, in terms of our local budgets, to pay for all these projects. So who is going to pay for these projects? Well, we're going to talk about that specifically as I talk with you about some of the action plans. And when we get to the last webinar in this series, when we talk about implementation, we'll talk more about funding. But at this stage, what I want to impress upon you is that you're really through your general project plan, you're taking an expansive view. You're not just sort of following the eligibility requirements of a particular funding program and figuring out which programs can you fund, which programs can you not fund. You're trying to think holistically about the range of interventions, whether they're physical, real property, infrastructural, operational, programmatic, and how all of these different projects over the long term could come together to create a better place. So even if you've got projects which you think, this is going to be really hard to fund, it doesn't lend itself well to a particular program, or the project is not necessarily ready, there's a lot of other steps involved, don't lose consideration of that project. Make a place for it within your general project plan that you can come back to when you've gotten further on thinking about different types of funding sources or different implementation pathways or different partners that may be able to carry that project forward in a way that you as a locality may not be well equipped to do so, at least not right now. So let's go to step 1 for our general project plans. Well, I'm giving you here an example of a revitalization goal and accompanying set of strategies that came from Olean as part of their DRI initiative. And here they set up a goal. There were several, but they set up one that says, downtown Olean will be livable and complete, a place with a variety of attractive, affordable housing options and a range of amenities for residents. And then there's 5 corollary strategies that were also attached to this goal that offer a greater level of specification. But you'll notice that the strategies don't identify particular projects or places or necessarily the identity of a specific organization or developer or a department. The strategies are broader than that. And so your first step when you're beginning to think about, well, what are the projects I need to go forward as part of our revitalization initiative, is you start to look at these strategies and you start to ask yourself, well, what might be projects or locations that could help carry forward this strategy. And as you're doing so, remain mindful of the fact that your goals, if they came out of a well-executed community-based visioning strategy, are essentially going to be not a carte blanche, but an invitation for you to be thinking about certain longer-term outcomes that the community has put forward. So two things are going on in this stage, right? You're looking at the strategies and thinking about particular projects and beginning to list them. And then secondly, you're reminding and reaffirming the connection of those projects to the community's goals as they articulated through their visioning process, a process which also would have included the inventory of community needs that we addressed in a previous webinar. Your next step is to inventory potential development sites. So here I show you two maps. I show you one map, and they're both from Batavia, and one shows you the location, the boundaries of underutilized sites, sites that are vacant, sites that may have problematic land uses associated with them or environmental hazards associated with them. And then I have another map that shows the sites which are owned by various public entities, whether it be the Batavia Development Corp or the City of Batavia or by the County Genesee. And this is a really key stage because you're starting to see where you might have parcels that are in play. And as part of this process, you want to identify, working with your building departments, your finance departments, your tax departments, you want to create an inventory of buildings which are vacant or foreclosed or tax delinquent, the ones that are publicly owned, not code compliant, buildings which you may learn are currently for sale or have been for sale. Now, do you need to map it? I think you do. And this is an area, not all parts of the analytical process of revitalization planning require the investment in mapping resources. But I would say that with regard to identifying potential opportunity sites, you want to really have it all laid out. And it's going to start helping you to see the interrelationship of sites where the intervention at multiple adjoining sites might facilitate the creation of an energy or a hub, right? And even if you're dealing with a small city or village and you've got just one main street, just dive in deeper, understand, the 15 or 20 buildings that are along that main street and what their status is. Doing this is also going to do something else. It's going to make sure as you come up with different land use concepts that you attach them to the right site. You might have some assumptions that the perfect location for a new multifamily building or for a pocket park is X location because there has been advocacy for that intervention for many years from a property owner, or it's a project that has been strongly endorsed by a member of your council, of your boards. But here you're starting to look systemically at the entirety of your community, and you may surprise yourself. You may find that the place that has long been championed as the perfect place for an anchor mixed use project or a pocket park is actually somewhere else when you start to look at the flows of people and the flows of activity, the opportunities from adjoining sites. So gather this information, inventory it tabularly if it's all you've got, but try and get it mapped so that you can really understand it spatially. Now we start to get to a more exciting part. Here's where we start to catalog our potential projects. And I'm showing you here an image from Kingston earlier on in their own DRI process, where they started to identify different places where they may actually undertake changes and investments. And when you're at this stage, as I mentioned to you earlier, I invite you to not be saddled by feasibility or implementation details. Really just start to attach development concepts to your sites that emerged as opportunity sites through your previous analysis of vacant or publicly owned or underutilized sites, and start to catalog them and build a list of what might be actions that result in change. And once you have that list, open the doors. Really try and go back to your community and dialogue with them about what you're missing. And I'm just showing you a few examples here of different types of public engagement efforts that have been aimed at various ways of collecting community input on projects, whether it's an open meeting or inviting folks to come up with their own projects, local business owners, community organizations. Let them, be included in an open call for revitalization projects, and see what they are thinking about changes that they may actually not only just support or partner on, but might actually offer leadership on or have been working on. And you might also want to survey your community, find out how they're thinking about potential projects, which ones are capturing their attention, which ones are they perhaps concerned about or even adverse to, and why. So here's where you're starting this process of vetting different types of actions, and hopefully also refining your understanding of them, diversifying them, expanding a list. And as part of this process, it's kind of inevitable that certain projects that were on your initial catalog, they may drop off, and new ones may come in their place, or you may start modifying some initial ideas. Then we come to the next phase, which is the creation of action plans. So as I mentioned earlier, the action plans are really where you start to get down into the details of how you would actually translate a particular project concept into a plan of action. And these plans of action are going to include a description of the project, how your project is going to align with goals and strategies, who might be involved in it, how is your project positioned in terms of its readiness for implementation? Is it financially feasible? And if so, how? And then what are the benefits it's going to bring? And then lastly, what's the timeline? How long is it going to take for this project from beginning to end? So for the next few slides, I'm going to just use an example from Plattsburgh's marketing, branding, and signage project that came out of their DRI plan, just as a way of illustrating for you how different types of components of an action plan are rendered. And this is just meant to be illustrative. These topic areas for an action plan, if you know them, it'll make it easier for you if you end up becoming a DRI or New York Forward recipient to draft a project profile. But this is also sort of a universal exercise. So if you've got some project ideas that are brewing and you're not even pursuing quite yet a grant, I invite you to think about, well, have I thought about all of these different issues? Have I put them down on paper? Do I really know that this is an actionable project? So let's dive in. So first, you want to describe your project. And that's going to include identification of the purpose of the project, its scope, its location, and maybe a conceptual illustration or drawing of the project. So here I give you an example that just defines what the purpose is for the marketing and signage project from Plattsburgh. And you may notice there's some pictures here of signage and information kiosk and banners that are coming from localities that are not Plattsburgh. And I purposefully show this to you because when you're at this beginning stage, you may not have the resources to engage an urban designer or a graphic designer to do original conceptual illustrations, but you can still create a book of graphic images that show examples from other localities that have undertaken that type of initiative. And then when you're ready, when you're further along with the project development, well, then maybe you expend the resources and start dealing with rendering. But for the moment, you just really want to create kind of a visual inventory of images that help us understand what the project might look like. Then your action plan is going to start to show how your project is really aligning with goals and strategies, right? So I would say that to the greatest extent possible, try and look at the way your project is responding to the goals and strategies within your revitalization plan itself, or alternatively, the regional plans, or both of those. The plans that are, the goals and strategies from the regional economic development councils that represent your community. But I would also say that you may want to take a peek at the other places where there's goal and strategy language in your comp plan, in your area plans, in your ED strategic plans. In an ideal universe, you would have formulated perfectly a community-based revitalization plan, goal and strategic framework that reflected and integrated all of the ideas and goals and strategies that came out of your other plans, out of your comp plan, out of your area plans, out of your ED strategic plans. But it doesn't always work that way, or you might not be as far enough along on your revitalization planning process to have distinct goals and strategies. So I advise you to take a broad look. Look at all of the different ways you've been envisioning, all the different ways you've been setting goals and strategies for your community, and then take your project and then begin to think about how it matches. Go through the language, see if it actually is consistent. And I'll show you more examples as we go further for different types of projects about how this goal and strategic alignment would work. Then you have to identify how you're going to make this happen by determining who is going to be in charge. So there's a few actors involved. The first one, and arguably the most important one, is your project sponsor. This is the entity that has the capacity, both in terms of the legal capacity and also the human resources to undertake a project, to lead it, to ensure that all the future steps related to planning and analysis and coordination and funding applications, site acquisition, and who can be the receipt of funds for the project, whether they're privately financed or if they're publicly financed through grants. So that's your project sponsor. But then there's other entities involved. You may be coordinating a project as the project sponsor. You might be coordinating with other departments within a city. You might be coordinating with particular subcommittees that have a role, like, or you might, if you're working on like a signage and marketing campaign, the project might be led by you as a locality, but you might be coordinating with the business improvement district or a merchant association or your neighboring communities or your townie. So you want to know who is going essentially to be your friend in the project. No, they may not lead, but they're going to be there, and they're going to have an involvement in at least some pivotal part of the process. Then there's your project partners. Project partners may sound a little bit like coordinating agencies, but they're different. These are folks who are in it for the long haul. And it might be, for example, if you're developing a site, that your project partner is a private developer. It might be if you're working on a park project that your ongoing project partner might be the business improvement district that shoulders some of the ongoing operating costs with the maintenance of that project. Or if you're working on a social service program, maybe you as a locality help to get the funds and set it up, but there's actually a nonprofit organization that houses that program within their own spaces and administers it and operates it and evaluates it. Then lastly, there's contractors. Contractors you should think about as consultants who or building professionals who may take on a particular piece of the project, but for a shorter term duration. They don't have a long-term stake. They don't have a long-term financial stake, and their scope may be limited. They are in charge of doing one particular type of activity associated with the project, right? So here, for the example from Plattsburgh, when they developed this project, they anticipated that the project sponsor here would be within the city, the community development office. And they looked to see, does that office have the capacity, the background, the capacity to be able to undertake a marketing and branding program? And then they thought about their project partners, who might be the organizations such as, an art center or a historical association or a chamber with whom they would work. And though they didn't specify it at the time, of composing their action plan, they also eventually came to enlist contractors, whom I'll describe later on, to help them with the design and the delivery of their marketing and branding concepts. Then you have to determine how ready you are for the project. And there's a lot to be thinking about here. So you've got a project concept, sounds like a great idea, strategically aligned. It's you've got someone who wants to do the project. You've got a leader for the project, right? But then we have to think about, well, are we ready to go? Is it ready to be pursued? Do we have what it takes to apply for funding for the project? And so here are some questions you have to ask yourself. If it's a development project, who has site control? Does the project sponsor already have site control? Or is it going to need to be conveyed or transferred? If it's a development project, do you have the right regulatory environment? Is the zoning supportive of the development concept? Will that have to be changed? Might you have to apply for some state permits if it's an environmental project or a transportation project? And are there any bodies, whether they're state or local or county, that need to sign off on it? Is there reason to believe that these things may not happen, that you may not get a zoning change, that you may not get the permits, or that there's certain approval bodies that have issues with the project and won't sign off on it until there's some changes? Public support is key. Hopefully, you've got your goals, of course, but hopefully you're also checking in throughout the process to make sure that the community sees the project as a response to their needs and that they're verbalizing it. And then the last one, I realize it sounds a little bit redundant, community need and public support. But what I'm trying to get at here is that the project ideally would be ready in terms of public support, but it also would be ready in terms of the degree to which there's an understanding that the project is a direct response to urgent community needs, whether they may be environmental or economic or social equity. And you might not always have public support for certain types of community needs, whether they be a change in development patterns or increase in affordable housing or the provision of a particular type of social service or change to a particular street or removal of parking. And yet there may be other factors. And the more you understand those factors, the more you understand the level of responsiveness that you can expect of the project to these different factors, the more ready you are to go forward, along with consideration of these other indicators of project readiness. The financial feasibility, many different factors are involved in this part of the action plan. Here I'm showing you the example from Pittsburgh's marketing program, where they identified what their project costs would be and where they would get funding, both out of DRI as well as potential other funding sources. They also thought about the return on their investment, how these expenditures would result in different types of benefits. So I offer you here a list of all the different things you may want to be thinking about in terms of financial feasibility. And in that list, I also mention market analysis, which can be really helpful for redevelopment projects in terms of making sure that if you were to build something, that tenants would come. And I also included within this list economic impacts, understanding how the project might affect your community's tax base. So there's a lot of factors here. You may not have all the information. You may have enough information for a certain type of project, like a major redevelopment project, to go forward with a pro forma, a financial model that projects what is going to be the long-term financial performance of that project, its profitability. But maybe for a simpler project, you may not have all that information. You might also not need all that information. You might simply, for example, a public realm improvement, the installation of banners or signage improvements, really just need to get what is going to be the cost of that project and an understanding of how you're going to be able to fund it. The evaluation of the revitalization benefits is also part of your action plan. Here's where you want to imagine the future. What happens in a year's time once this project is operational? What happens in 3 to 4 years? What happens in 10 years? Thinking about the different stages of the life cycle of this project. How is it going to change your community? And what are the types of benefits, whether they be environmental ones, such as the reduction of vehicular trips, or the reduction in carbon emissions, or economic benefits, such as a longer term strengthening and diversification of your tax base, or equity benefits like greater integration racially and economically of the region's community, the breakage of longstanding patterns of segregation, or different levels of access that some of your subpopulations have to housing or to jobs. All of these are things you want to be thinking about as you're fleshing out your action plan and thinking about, have I crafted an action plan that is really going to bring me the types of benefits that we are aspiring for, right? And put those down and think about who are going to be your beneficiaries, who is going to be the receipt of this project's fruits. And that also helps you, it kind of ties in with the kind of benefits, the equity. Is there only a particular subpopulation? Is there a side of town that is not served by the project, or one particular group that's excluded? So think about that too, who your beneficiaries are. And then lastly, contemplate the timeline for completing the project. How long is it going to take? And the answer is usually much longer than you think, because there are many factors, and not just COVID, that affect how your project could be delayed. Here's what I'm going to say. If you can find parallel projects and talk with the project managers of those projects, it will help you formulate a more realistic timeline, and to avoid a situation where you are months, if not years, delayed in a project simply because you underestimated how long it takes to get a rezoning done, or financial closure on a bank, or how long it takes to get the receipt of monies from a particular grant. You may be under pressure from certain grants that you may be applying to show that a project can be completed within a given period of time. I would advise you, though, to not set unrealistic goals for completion. And if it turns out that your project is going to take a longer time because you have to do A, B, and C before you get it moving forward, then focus on getting A, B, C, and forward. And when the time is right for you to go to bat for funding, then that project will be all the more competitive because you will have done the work required to get it ready. So now let's go through a few case studies. And I'm going to just present to you the action plans rather synoptically for each of these case studies to kind of illustrate for you the process that we just went through in terms of describing all the component pieces of an action plan. And I've chosen a variety of projects here, all of which I've hinted at before. They happen to all have been funded in some way by DRI monies, but they were also projects which had been around even before the DRI program had existed and had been long considered. And they're projects with complex funding arrangements where it's not just DRI monies, but a variety of different sources went into making them happen. And these are here hopefully to inspire you on different types of ways that you may be able to move revitalization forward in your own community. This is a project from Olean, the Manny Hanny building, which is the adaptive reuse of a centuries-old, beautiful building located in the downtown, originally constructed as the site for the National Bank in 1915. And this is a project that fulfills a revitalization strategy that was aimed at the restoration and adaptive use of historic buildings in Olean's downtown as a way of creating stronger cultural anchors, celebrating the history of the community, and really being able to bring active uses that would bring not only more people, but also, a more productive tax base to the surrounding environment. Making this project happen required the involvement of the Olean Urban Renewal Agency, which acquired the property from a private landowner. But it actually took quite some time, even after that acquisition, to get the parties all to align toward an actual viable redevelopment project. And here's a building that was vacant, I think, for 24, 25 years. So, there had been many successive efforts at trying to bring it back into productive use. The community had long wanted it. But what it took to make it happen was tying together multiple financial sources, new market tax credits, Restore New York monies, historic tax credits, as well as an experienced developer and tax abatements in tandem with DRI funding to bring it all together. The project is just about complete and, entering into the leasing phase. And relatively speaking, from the time in which this iteration of it came into being, this iteration of the action plan, and moved along pretty expeditiously in spite of the pandemic. And its benefits in terms of housing and building preservation seem to be on track. So I encourage you to take a look at this project. It's very well documented, and there's also information on it on the DRI website, the link of which we will again show later on in the presentation. Here's another redevelopment project example that I think will speak to many communities that have long faced challenges with the remediation of some of their brownfield, formerly industrial sites. This project in Batavia, called Ellicott Station, is the redevelopment of industrial parcels that had been contaminated, and includes the demolition of those buildings, the treatment, the cleanup of the site, and their replacement with a mixed-use development project that will include workforce housing, in addition to the preservation of another building on the site that would be used as the site of a brewery. So this project was a response to a strategy at encouraging the redevelopment of underutilized development sites, and also sites which may be environmentally contaminated. It was a site that was ready to go once the project, once the site had been secured through a tax foreclosure process, a process that probably could have been done earlier. But I believe that once the stars aligned around the financing and the time was right for the property to be acquired by the Batavia Development Corporation, they went through that process of being able to secure the site and establish site control. As you can see on this slide, there's a number of different funding sources that were here, including tax abatements and LIHTC, low-income housing, tax credit monies. This was a complicated project. It was a complicated project because of the cleanup. It was complicated because of the securing of the site control through the tax foreclosure process. It was complicated because of the multiplicity of funding sources. And a result of all of those things, and in tandem with the effects of the pandemic, this project was considerably slowed down. And it is moving forward in terms of the demolition having taken place over the past year, the funds being secured, and the redevelopment going forward. I encourage you to look at this because it is a good case study in some of the challenges that are involved in a complicated redevelopment site, and yet one that is really important if you're hoping to achieve benefits like cleanup of a long-standing contaminated site and the provision of affordable housing. So do take a look at this one. I'm going to pivot now toward talking about some smaller interventions. So for example, from Oswego, we have a pair of projects that were pursued with DRI monies along with other sources. One of them being a conversion of a right-of-way that had been used, that it was right in the heart of Oswego's downtown and that had just been used for parking. And the conversion of this right-of-way of this street into a pocket park, accompanied with programming of concerts and events. And then a secondary project that involved the installation of complete streets concepts to a stretch of a major main street, if you will, within their community that had essentially bifurcated the north and south parts of its downtown, and through a range of pedestrian improvements, facilitated greater pedestrian access through the downtown and as well to this Water Street Park. So here's an example of a pair of projects, both that have the effect of improving pedestrian circulation and that respond to strategies that had been decided upon as part of their revitalization plan that entailed the creation of more green space or the fulfillment of complete streets concepts. From a tactical perspective, doing a project like this obviously required coordination with New York State Department of Transportation, for the parts of the right-of-way that were controlled by the state. And it also required, obviously, hiring engineering companies to work on the final designs and construction plans for this. But it did happen. And something I want to emphasize here is that the project took on a more ambitious scale in terms of the bells and whistles that came with the pocket park or with the complete streets plan. There's ways that projects like this can be done even simpler pocket parks or more targeted types of pedestrian improvements, and that they can be done relatively quickly. Both of these projects were done relatively on time compared to the timelines that were set up at the time in which they were conceived until the time in which they were complete and became operational. Very close similarity, about 2.5 years. This is a project I actually got to work on a few years ago from Kingston, and it's the small grants program that I talked about earlier. It's actually 3 different types of projects rolled into one. One of the projects is the delivery of 5,000 micro grants to local business owners. The second part of the program entails the granting of $20,000 in grants for commercial facade improvements to local business owners. And a third part involves grants that are given to the owners of a certain income level to help offset the costs that they need for residential rehabilitation. So the strategy that was at play here was supporting local businesses. But there was a lot of other strategies beyond local businesses that were thought of here. And one of them was also about, well, how do we make it easier for residents of Kingston to age in place, to stay within their housing, to have access to funds to improve the quality of that housing. So two of the programs were aimed at supporting local businesses. One of the programs was more focused in terms of making it easier to improve the physical conditions of housing. This project has an implementation partner in Ulster County's Office of Economic Development, and through a shared service agreement, the City of Kingston and Ulster County are partnering on the delivery of this project. And it took longer for this project to come to fruition, and part of that had to do with the effects of the pandemic. But after a few years, it is actually going forward fully. And the first round of it for the micro grants, the applications were received through May of this year. They're now under review, and we expect an announcement of the recipients. Will probably be about 12 businesses that will receive $5,000 grants to use for their businesses. And they can use it for a variety of improvements, physical improvements within their buildings. And then our last case study, coming full circle, which is the one that I had used in order to show you examples of the ways in which all the component parts of an action plan are created, comes from Plattsburgh. And again, this is an example of a project that can be taken on by a smaller city. It's if you're thinking about preserving or celebrating your historic heritage, an ambitious way of doing that might be the Manny building, where you essentially restore a historic building to productive use. But you could also take a milder set of interventions that are aimed at bringing in banners that celebrate key parts of the history of your community, or as is being done in Plattsburgh, the introduction of vintage forms of signage. The other thing that Plattsburgh has done as part of this project was create an interactive map of its key destinations. And I really encourage you to go online. It's beautifully done. It will make you want to go to Plattsburgh, which I think really speaks well to the success of this project in terms of achieving the underlying strategy of placing the community on the map, creating greater awareness of where Plattsburgh is and what is there and why you should visit. And the revitalization benefits, and we'll see how this unfolds in the years to come, that are hoped for is that all these interventions through the signage and the wayfinding improvements, the referencing to historical events and characters, that all of it will ultimately bring in greater visitors, greater tourism to the community, and fuel greater transactions and patronage of the retail businesses within downtown Plattsburgh. So lastly, I have been talking a lot about examples from New York, and I encourage you to look at more examples from New York through the DRI website. You'll find lots of examples of other projects. I think that not only is New York lucky, but many other states are lucky that now we have these examples of other projects from New York that are in various stages of completion. But I still invite you to look at this list of links I've provided of resource guides for the redevelopment of all different types of communities, but with a focus on smaller cities, including rural places. And hopefully this set of links and the case studies that are in them will inspire you. Some of them are older than others, but they will still hopefully jog your imagination as you think about how to develop particular projects to carry forward your revitalization goals and strategies. Thank you.
Great. So with that, we have received a few questions. If there are any more, please put those in the chat. Before we get into those, though, I do want to remind everyone that our final webinar in this series will be on August 29th, and that'll be on the implementation of a revitalization plan. Today's webinar and all others in the series are posted on our New York Forward website. And with that, we will grab the questions here. All right, so our first question was, is the idea that we have to do this mapping for this application or that we do it if we are awarded? So just to clarify here, the only required map for the application is the map of the proposed New York Forward area. But I do believe this question was asked while we were looking at mapping potential projects. So no, this would not be required, but it's certainly helpful to show how these projects are synergistic and complementary of one another and show how they'll collectively transform your downtown. Let's see. And then the next question we have here is, when you create a micro grant program for facades, etc., do you typically require some kind of match from the property owner to ensure they have some skin in the game? Would a match be required as part of the New York Forward? So the micro grant program, or the small project fund as we call it, will require a match of at least 25%. This will be administered locally. So if in the planning phase and the discussions, the local planning community or committee desires to have a higher grant match, that is that can be done. But this match will be required of the participants taking advantage of the program. And then we did get a question saying that a lot of these examples are from places with bigger communities, tax bases, sources of public assistance that aren't always available in smaller communities, asking if we have examples of those as well. I'll say right now we are currently going through the first round of New York Forward, so we will likely very soon have some examples. But actually, let me see. Yeah, so we don't really have finalized examples of those just yet, but we do have some coming down the pipeline. It looks like maybe we have one last question here. A key project element that is often forgotten is what happens after the project is completed in terms of who is responsible for its long-term maintenance and where is the funding going to come from for that particular maintenance. So one of the components that we look at when reviewing these DRI and New York Forward projects is the project sponsors both readiness to move the project forward and their capacity. So while these projects are being developed, those are two key components that are evaluated